Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Sarah, and I'm excited to be here on this Tuesday to talk about another book and to have another author interview. This book is a mystery. It's set in 1929, so we're at the height of Prohibition. We're right before the stock market crash that caused the Great Depression. And this book is by Susanna Calkins. It is called Murder Knocks Twice. And I do have copies to give away of this book. So if you, after listening to the interview, think you might be interested in getting a copy of this book, then just stay tuned to the end of the podcast and you'll find out how to win a copy of Murder Knocks Twice by Susanna Calkins. The synopsis is as follows. Gina Ricci takes on a job as a cigarette girl to earn money for her ailing father and to prove to herself that she can hold her own at Chicago's most notorious speakeasy, the Third Door. She's enchanted by the harsh, glamorous world she discovers. The sleek socialites sipping bootlegged cocktails, the rowdy ex-servicemen playing poker in a curtained back room, the flirtatious jazz pianist, and the brooding photographer, all overseen by the club's imposing owner, Signora Castellazzo, but the staff buzzes with whispers about Gina's predecessor, who died under mysterious circumstances, and the photographer, Marty, warns her to be careful. When Marty is brutally murdered, with Gina as the only witness, she's determined to track down his killer. What secrets did Marty capture on his camera, and who would do anything to destroy them? As Gina searches for answers, she's pulled deeper into the shadowy truths hiding behind the third door. So that is the mystery, Murder Knocks Twice. It is so much fun. I really enjoyed this book. I loved the setting. And if you are a regular listener of the podcast, you know I've been talking a lot about the Maisie Dobbs series, it starts right around the same time, the end of the 20s, beginning of the 30s. And while there aren't a lot of similarities, except for women in this era solving mysteries, kind of independent women, I'm fascinated with this time period, and I'm fascinated by the differences. So there are some similarities because they both have references to World War I, of course, and the consequences of that war. So many young men were killed, so many people were killed in that war, and then how that affected life and culture going forward. But of course, the major difference is that the United States has Prohibition. It's set in Chicago rather than London, and whereas Maisie Dobbs is kind of this proper, formal English woman, Gina is a Chicagoan, is that right? She's Irish Italian. It's the 20s, so you've got some great slang and things that Maisie Dobbs in her proper Englishness would never say. So you get this really interesting look of two women solving mysteries in somewhat similar circumstances, but in very different locations in the same time period. So I really found that fascinating. And the book itself is just interesting. It's got some humor. It's got great descriptions of the speakeasy and this time period, especially Chicago in this time period where Al Capone is still a major figure. He's a character in the book insofar as he was present in the life of Chicago, and everybody knew his name and knew of his supposed activities, etc. So he's kind of a character in the book, but doesn't actually make an appearance. And then just the fascination behind the bootlegged liquor, the rum runners, etc. I found the whole thing fascinating. But as you know, I was a history major, and this was way better than the books I had to read about Chicago in my history classes, where we learned all about the insane political machines of Chicago throughout its storied history, this was a lot more fun to learn about a period of time in Chicago. So again, the book is Murder Knocks Twice. It is by Susanna Calkins. And let's go ahead and get to that interview with Susanna so you can hear more about the book and the series from Susanna herself. Hello, Susanna. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here to talk about your book, Murder Knocks Twice. Before we get to the book, though, I would love for myself and my listeners just to get to know you a little bit. So if you could share a bit about yourself.
I live just outside Chicago. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I have a couple kids, couple cats, and I've been enjoying writing for a long time, and I'm a historian by training. So I do like to bring in the history, as I think we'll talk about, into my books.
Yes. And you teach history, is that correct?
Well, actually, I'm a director of our Learning and Teaching Center at my university, but I do teach some classes in history. Every year I teach a graduate class in the history and philosophy of higher education, which actually, when I was working in the archives, interested in the context for Murder Knocks Twice. So yeah, I teach one graduate class in history a year and some undergrad classes from time to time. Okay.
Well, thank you for that. So let's talk about that book then. Can you give us a quick overview of Murder Knocks Twice?
Oh, yeah. So Murder Knocks Twice is set in 1929 Chicago, and it's set in a speakeasy. And my protagonist, Gina, is basically starting her first day on the job as a cigarette seller and a cocktail waitress. And so we enter this world on the same day that she does. And right away she finds that people there know her and she's never known them. There's sort of some mysterious questions going on, and things are going to ensue that kind of get a mystery started. But one of them being that she's filling the position of a young woman, Dory, who was killed under mysterious circumstances. And so there's a lot of questions right from day one of what she's doing there and what happened to Dory.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of questions and a lot of, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about Dory. So immediately, something happened.
Right away, try to raise some questions. This is already a strange new world for her. Gina is not someone who is very wealthy. She's working class. Her father is unwell and really can't hold a position. Her mother passed away when she was younger. Her brother died in the Great War. And so she's got to make a living. And the kitchen she had been working at had closed. And so, this position, she was told about this position, so she decided she would try it out. But, this is not the kind of place she usually frequents, because you have to have money or someone to take you there, because it's kind of expensive to go to a speakeasy. And so, I wanted her to sort of, try to figure out this world in the same way as the reader is kind of like, what is this world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts of the story is just the setting is amazing because it is at a really interesting time in history, right before the Great Depression, but we're still in Prohibition, and plus it's in Chicago, which has a very, let's just say, shady past in terms of politics and crime.
Exactly. When I was making a decision about where my new series would be set and, when it would be set, I'm a transplant, as I mentioned, to Chicago. And, when I first got to Chicago, one of the first things, of course you come to Chicago and the 20s is still very, very lived history here. Everything's about Al Capone. And of course there are things outside of that, but you just hear that right away. And, there's sort of this, it's still around. Even when I talk about when I was still writing the book, and I would talk about, I'm going to be putting out a book in 1929 Chicago. People at book clubs for my other book would say, "Oh, well, I've got this story. My great grandmother used to cut Al Capone's hair, or where they were rum runners off of Lake Michigan." It's amazing to me how lived, the Prohibition culture really still is, or, people have these kind of passed on memories about it, which I just found so interesting. Very unlike my previous series set in 17th century London, which is a little more distant.
Right.
But yeah, so the 1920s was such an interesting time period for me in a lot of ways.
See, I'm not the only one who thought this was an interesting time period. I love when I get to interview people who have similar interests to me, and I can totally geek out, whether I do that actually on the podcast or just in my head where I'm like, a historian. Yeah, I don't get out much. It is time to take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking about Susanna's inspiration, for this series. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Susanna Calkins about the first book in her Speakeasy series called Murder Knocks Twice. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview. So what was your inspiration then to start this series?
Well, I think my inspiration was, I really was thinking about, 1920s, and I really always have been interested in sort of the roaring 20s. I mean, I like the music and the films from the area. I like the cocktails, and I thought, this would be kind of fun. The reason I said it in 1929, which was not my original choice. Originally, I thought about 1930, the great stock market crash of October. I originally was set in 1930, but last frenetic year of 1929, that last kind of sparkling year where people don't know that there's this crash coming, although there are some indicators which, regular people don't know, but, other people knew. And I just thought it would be so interesting to set, and of course, 1929 in Chicago history, it was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which is the other big marker of 1929. And, while gangsters aren't a huge part of the book, you can't really get around the gangs, the, Prohibition era. And, so to me, it was just so intriguing to think about, where to put a speakeasy too, and what was going on in 1929. There's so much warfare, not just between gangs, Irish gangs and Italian gangs and, Serbia. I mean, there's a lot of gangs. But like where exactly to place the speakeasy, I thought a lot about that because different parts of the city had different things going on. I set side of Chicago, which is where the University of Illinois Chicago campus is now. That campus was created in this neighborhood in the 1960s, so it essentially disrupted all of the neighborhoods that were there prior, which is, quite terrible actually for the community. But for a writer, it's kind of a great thing because I could realign the streets, I could put my barbershops where I needed them to be, I could put my speakeasy where it needed, and nobody's going to say, oh, there wasn't a florist shop there or a tea shop or, so I was able to kind of reconstruct a world that, hadn't been there, that I could just kind of make up my own world without people telling me it wasn't really like that. So that's why I picked that area. But then the more I studied and historian, it was interesting because this was actually an area that wasn't controlled by gangs. I thought, well, this is a good opportunity for whoever's there to have some impact. And so that's why I have my Senora kind of controlling the area. And, it's kind of a interesting place to set a speakeasy.
Mm-hmm. And your main character, Gina, is interesting in this world because she has an Italian father and an Irish mother, which
causes her to be kind of not part of either world and part of both worlds in terms of that. So what about Gina do you think will resonate with readers?
For me, it was kind of interesting, thinking about Gina. I wanted her to kind of come out of a couple different worlds, in this case specifically more of an Italian and an Irish world, because there was a lot of conflict between these groups at the time. And also there was sort of this tradition of the Irish kind of being cops. And there was a lot of, Italians, not the stereotype, but there were a few that were involved in, kind of different kind of out of the law activities. And, and actually where I went to school in Philadelphia, there was a lot of these similar kind of, because Philadelphia and Chicago are very similar. And I just remember there was sort of these tensions that I was even aware of growing up, even in the 80s, tensions between these groups. And I thought this has to be similar. And I did some research, and it was kind of like this, and I was just really interested in making her relatable. Like I said, I wanted her to be someone who was, kind of had to work hard, had to, have these kind of jobs to kind of support her family, and I wanted her to sort of wonder what it was like to work in a speakeasy, because I wondered that. And I thought maybe other people would wonder that too. It actually work. There's not necessarily one way. And I thought, well, other people might kind of have questions. And she's a waitress, and she's selling cigarettes, and just felt like it's kind of a relatable job. And also I have her kind of dressing wrong when she gets there. She thinks she's going to have this nice dress, and even the clerk is kind of like, oh, you have a secretarial position, and she doesn't even understand. She's just not really dressed right. So I kind of felt like that's all kind of relatable, because she's kind of like me in that way. I think I would totally be completely wrong in all of it. And then, have to learn and be taught.
I think I would be as well. I mean, we definitely have an image from like movies of what it would be like, but in the movies you always have the dramatic things happen, and here there are dramatic things that happen, but you also get that day to day of her feet hurt, and there's there's tensions between her and her coworkers, just kind of your normal things that happen in a job.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I was like, well, how hard is it to wear one of these trays around your neck? And I was like, oh, it's got to pull at your neck hairs, and and you have to wear these pumps, these high heels and short skirts. It's like it's all riding up and falling down, and I'm sure the inconveniences. At least that's how I would have experienced it. So I thought it might be kind of relatable.
Yes, and it's 1929, so you don't have nylons as we know them. You have to, you have to have garters.
Foundational undergarments, yes.
Yes. Yes.
They didn't have like Spanx and things like that keeping you in place either.
No, exactly. What kind of research did you do then for the book?
So, I had a lot of fun doing the research for this book, and it was kind of different from my first series. But I did do, I really did. I read through every edition of the Daily Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, January 1st of 1929 through December 31st. And, that's a really great way to kind of just get headlines and find out what's going on. I looked through the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and that's just really fun. You could order anything you wanted. It's basically like Amazon, but Sears and Roebuck, you could get a house, and you could order a study course, or you could get hairbrushes and batteries and wagon wheels, which is great. Mm-hmm. I did that kind of thing. And of course, it's a lot easier in certain ways. There's certain things like YouTube videos that I was able to watch that show even like advertising that they'd have in movie theaters run before the feature. And there was one that was extremely helpful on how to use the new telephones of 1927. And, because I had wondered, because, from watching movies and things, you always see, people like call connect me. And I thought, but then why do they have direct numbers? Because you would see, businesses having a direct number, like were people all able to call directly? And so luckily I found out that yes, you did not have to always go through a switchboard and call for the operator and put in your number. You could dial. But it was very interesting watching people learn how to use the new telephones and the new telephone system that came about in the late 1920s. But so there's all kinds of interesting YouTube videos. I have my Gina will become need to learn how to do photography, and I had to spend a lot of time researching what kind of cameras, how do you develop film, how could a regular person develop film, what kind of materials would they need, and make prints. And, luckily, all kinds of YouTube videos about 1920s film, which was fun. And, of course, I also always joke about this, but I really did do what I call cocktail research. I found this list of 100 Prohibition-era cocktails, and I said, I'm going to try all 100 of them before my book comes out. And I got to, number 35. I can't drink these. They're just gross. So I stopped my journey on that. But, I listened to 20s music as I wrote, and, and that kind of, I think, helped make it kind of a little more bouncier, actually, than my other books, a little lighter. But I think that's, so I did that kind of, and also I read, books, and secondary historical books and written by historians and things like that from the era. Watched some movies from the 20s, just to kind of get a feel for it, too. But yeah, it's very fun to do this kind of research.
Well, I'm just going to say that it's impressive that she made it to 35 on the cocktail list. I mean, that is some dedication and some awesome research. I'm not sure I would have made it that far myself. At any rate, we are going to take our second break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll have the conclusion to this interview. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion to my interview with Susanna Calkins about her book, Murder Knocks Twice.
Are there any autobiographical elements in the characters or the story in any way?
Autobiographical, interesting. I mean, I guess in a way, my protagonists always have a little bit of me. Like I mentioned, I think some of Gina, I think she's tougher than me, so I think I want her to be tougher. But I think there's definitely a little bit of the curiosity and the weirdness of it all. A regular person trying to figure out this world. But as we always sort of joke, people who write mysteries and have amateur sleuths such as Gina. I mean, the reality is, if I'm outside the coffee shop and all these police cars come up, I don't come up to the policeman and try to find out what's happening inside. And I go the other way. I'm like, the police are here, they can handle it. But of course, when you have an amateur sleuth, they get inquisitive in ways that, regular people can't be, because otherwise you'd have no story. So she's a little, they're always a little braver. And there are I don't know other autobiographical elements really so much as just her sense of both confusion and awe of this world. Maybe that's a little bit me as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is the first in your new series. So how many books do you have a plan for this series, or are you just going to write until you don't have any, until Gina says it's time to stop?
Well, I wish it kind of worked that way maybe, but second book, which I'm literally working, I have it I have my edits for that one. So that one should be coming out in, April or May of 2020. My original plan was to have 2 on one side of the crash and then 2 on the other side. So the first year when they're all reeling from it and starting the depression. But then I started working on book 3 and I ended up, I had to have it right after the crash. So it's like the crash happens at the end of October of 1929. And basically my third book picks up like 2 days later in November 1st. Cause I was like, I need to keep going with, because the crash was just so both momentous for the people who understood what had happened to them, and like still sort of distant for people who who didn't have stocks. Because, not everybody was on the stock market. So some people it didn't impact right away and they didn't quite know. So it's kind of an interesting set of tensions that was going on, because nobody really knew even right away how bad it was going to be in the next couple of years. So I just found that, but some people kind of figured it out. Like there were some people right away who were like, this is bad. So I just found that so interesting. Like there's these numbed people, and then these other people are just still like, oh, we're still in the 20s, we're still having fun. And those two beliefs are coming into very stark contrast. And you can tell, I mean, even the newspaper articles and, this is coming out of, writings from the time. But yeah, I hope to continue. I mean, I won't do like 50 books, but I would like to at least do 4 if I'm able to.
Mm-hmm. And you said you're currently working on the second book. So can you tell us a little bit about what's next for Gina without, giving too much away from either book?
So the second book is a few months later, and, she's settled in, and she's still selling cigarettes and drinks. She's not a performer, so she doesn't do that, and that won't be her role. She's been learning photography. She's getting better at that. She wants to become the photographer, but that still isn't quite happening. She's, developing a relationship with one of the characters in the book, Rourke. It's, there's still questions about where this relationship might be or where it's going. And right away, in this book, there's a few people are poisoned, and one person, and then maybe somebody else dies as well. This happens fairly early on in the book, and there's questions about, is the third door selling bad hooch? Because this is a real problem in the 20s. That sometimes, you get this bad batch, and it can be really serious, and people can die. And so there's this question of, did someone sell the third door bad hooch? Was this an actual poisoning? And so these are questions that Gina gets drawn into pretty quickly into. And her cousin, Nancy, who is better known as a policewoman, because policewomen had no recognition back then, not really. And she's kind of pushing the investigation a little bit more and bringing Gina into it.
So you've mentioned your other series a little bit so far, and that's the Lucy Campion Mysteries. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that series?
My first series, which has 4 books in it, were set in 17th century London during the time of the plague and the Great Fire. It's easy to remember because I always say it's 1666, so 666, the Devil's Year, which is what they would say. And it features Lucy Campion. In the first book, she is a chambermaid serving in the household of a local magistrate. And then over time, when circumstances change, she ends up becoming a printer's apprentice and a bookseller. And so these capacity allow her to kind of move around the society, and deaths happen. There's a lot of deaths in 17th century London from plague and all these things, but also, it's easy to disguise murders and look like they're natural causes. So Gina gets brought into several of these issues just by dint of her position. And I really wanted to set it in the 1660s because it really was a time of unprecedented social, for women and for people who without much means, like servants, because really, essentially, it sounds harsh to say, but so many people had died that, people could sort of take on new roles, and servants could become masters, and nobody would know that they would just take over the tools of the trade, and a lot of identity theft, and but also just people filling positions like women, similar to like after World War I and after World War II. Women got to do more what were traditionally men's occupations because the men were fighting or had passed away. It's very similar in 1666. so women are able to like do things. So that's why Gina's able to become a printer's apprentice, which is very uncommon for a woman at the time. So yeah, so these are, they're all mysteries, standalone, but the characters develop over the course of the 4 books. But you can read them all separately without, not being able to follow what's going on.
When did you start writing mysteries for publication? Is writing something that you've always wanted to do?
When I was a kid, I was always writing little stories and, writing books. You could tell even about, short things from being a kid. You could tell where I was influenced. I mean, I had one that I was just writing in a composition notebook for several years. I would just add these, like what I'd been reading. Oh, I guess I was in my Narnia stage, or I was in my Alice in Wonderland stage, or, because I could sort of like imitate some fan fiction, I guess. But, so I was always kind of writing stories and through high school. But in college, I always feel like, I even though I, have a PhD now, it's like college just beat the creativity out of me. But it wasn't until I was working on my PhD in history, and I was working in London for a couple months while I was doing research. I worked aboard the Golden Hind, which is a museum of a replica of Sir Francis Drake's ships that's dry docked in the sailor, a 16th century sailor, so a living history specialist tour guide. And during the week, and then on the weekend, I was a pirate because I did pirate parties for little British children. But it was fun because I would once a week I would have to stay on this ship doing ship watch all by myself, and I was on the Thames, and I would kind of look out at I was across the river from the monument to the Great Fire and St. Paul's Cathedral, which had been rebuilt. And I was just always kind of thinking about that time period. And then I was working on a master's project at the time before I was a PhD student, but it was I was working on domestic homicide in 17th century London, gender patterns. So I was looking at how women murdered differently. But what was interesting is I was researching these murder ballads, and I came across some just interesting, such fascinating things from these ballads. People would sing about murder as like the news of the day because people weren't literate, and they would just, sing the story and to pass it on to other people. And I was just so intrigued by these murder ballads, and they raised so many questions for me. But those questions basically became the first book that I wrote, A Murder at Rosamund's Gate. The questions that were there were so powerful to me. It was like, I need to resolve. Nobody could know the answers to these questions from back then, but I thought, well, I will write a book where I get to answer the questions for myself.
So then, out of the path that you took to become a published author, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always sort of the basic advice, which is, keep going, write the book that you want to read, and, don't try to just follow the trends, but like, what is it that you love? And really write that book, because I think that's the only way you can write 300 pages of anything unless you love this world that you're in, whatever world you're creating for yourself and your characters. When I talk to a lot of aspiring writers and people who just can't seem to keep going, and I talk to writers who do keep going, and one day I'm going to write about this more as a motivational thing, I think, but it is interesting. The ones that keep going, some of them are motivated by like, I have a pending contract, or, they say that they motivate themselves by like chocolate, or, they get to go on a shopping trip or something. But I think that the real ones find a way to love what they do, and they don't hate it. And, and I think it sounds so fundamental, but get excited about what you're working on. And this is the thing about motivation. If you're not excited in that moment, then work on something that I would say is writing adjacent. Like, for me, it might be like research something about that time period. If I don't feel like I can write, then I'm like, well, I did wonder what a 17th century bathroom might have looked like, a privy. So I might try to research that a little, and then like not to use that in the book so much, but for me, it's like finding pictures, or maybe you spend time looking at actor photos to kind of audition people for your characters. And I think that can be kind of inspiring. Like, what do these people actually look like? Or I always say to people, like, try to just interview your characters a little bit. Like, what motivated your characters when they were 5? What were they afraid of when they were 10? What were they ashamed of when they were 18? And like, if you kind of get those kinds of questions, it can trigger a lot of good thinking. And then actually that can be kind of help you kind of keep writing. But yeah, I mean, it really is, it's just persistence and just, maybe there's a time when you have to put the book aside and put it in the corner, put it in the proverbial folder, but you have to sometimes you just have to keep going. And that's, people say button chair, but that's really what it is.
All right. Thank you for that. And sounds like you love to read, you love to do research. When you take the time to read for yourself, do you have favorite authors or genres?
I have always loved mysteries. I mean, when I was a kid, I was always reading Agatha Christie. Later on, when I was in grad school, I found that people write historical mysteries. So Anne Perry and Charles Todd, I read these books because my mother had recommended them. And I didn't have a lot of time to read fiction in grad school, but that's when I was like, oh, maybe I can do this. Like, oh, maybe. And so, so I love those books. I read across all kinds of genre, but I mean, I love the books by Lori Rader Day, who writes, kind of contemporary, domestic kind of suspense. She's a wonderful writer. There's just so many writers now that I've been able to be exposed to that I love. I also really like dystopian books and, the YA, young adult books as well. So I try to read outside my genre as well.
I know you have a website, so if you can tell us the address of your website and any social media you might have that people can find you.
My website is www.susannacalkins.com, and I am on Facebook, Susanna Calkins. Both I have an author page and a regular friend page. And then on Twitter, I'm scalkins3. So, and actually I'm on Instagram now too, only for a couple weeks. So I'm still getting used to that. So honestly, I can't remember my handle for that, but I'm sure if you just put in Susanna Calkins, it comes up.
Okay. Thank you. We've talked about the books and we've talked about writing. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like for people to know about either of your series or just anything that we haven't covered?
I mean, the other reason I set the books in this era is because we're coming up on the 100th anniversary of the Volstead Act in October of this year. It was in 1919, October. To me, we're about to engage in this first decade of the Prohibition, and and of course now we have such interesting questions around Prohibition around marijuana and other kinds of legal medicines, and and I think there's a lot of similarities that we're seeing 100 years later, which I just find really interesting. It kind of resonates, just something that's interesting to me. But yeah, it's going to be exciting.
It's really interesting and we're coming up on the 20s again, and are they going to be the Roaring 20s? We don't know.
Yeah, it might be a little different.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me about the series and the first book, Murder Knocks Twice. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you again to Susanna for taking the time to talk to me not only about Murder Knocks Twice, but about her Lucy Campion series, as well as writing in general. I, as always, greatly appreciate it. And as I said before, thought this was such a fun book, such a great setting, and really interesting characters. So if you are interested in winning a copy of Murder Knocks Twice by Susanna Calkins, all you have to do is go to our social media pages, GSMC Book Review Podcast, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Comment on this episode, which is episode 168, of course, interview with Susanna Calkins, and you'll be automatically entered to win a copy of Murder Knocks Twice. So again, that's GSMC Book Review Podcast, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Comment on this episode and you'll be entered into that giveaway. So thank you so much to Susanna. Thank you as always to you, my listeners. I greatly appreciate you and your love of reading, because It's one of my favorite things in the world. So I appreciate anyone else who appreciates it. I hope you're having a great week. I hope you continue to have a great week. And I hope that week involves some time for you to go out and get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.